Before we start today's tutorial, I have an announcement to make. I have released a new Skillshare class. This one is different compared to the classes I've made so far, as we will be making an illustrated recipe card. In this class, I will show you how to turn this cream scone recipe into a beautiful illustrated recipe, but you can also bring the techniques across for other recipes as well if you have some personal favorites, since I will be sharing my whole thinking process right from the beginning, where I was considering the subjects into how I brainstorm and collect ideas to present each item, and also layout design, where you can quickly draw ideas before developing them into the final execution. Because I've chosen these cream scones to be the main subject matter of the recipe, I'll of course walk you through how I space the layout and divide the class into small lessons where you can paint along with me. I personally enjoyed this one as it's fairly quick to make, and it also brings back memories to my graphic design days when I had to plan layouts to bring text and images together into a beautiful composition. If you've never been a member on Skillshare, you can go to the link in my description box for a free trial, where you can get access to all the classes on Skillshare, including this one. And if you're already a member, hopefully you will also enjoy this class as much as my previous classes. So I hope to see you there, and let's get back to today's tutorial. Hi everyone, this is Nia, and today I'm going to paint a glass of steamy coffee. This could also be hot chocolate, I guess. I tried to paint this in a loose way, which isn't my usual go-to style when it comes to food illustration, but I wanted to just experiment a little bit. I started out by sketching the shape of the cup. I like to begin from the top of the cup because that will indicate how much drink we can see. And once I'm happy with the size and shape of the oval, I continued down to draw the rest of the cup. Then I just doubled the line of the oval to make it into a rim. Once I'm happy with the thickness of the rim, I'm going to draw on the handle. The first thing I draw out is the side of the handle, just to indicate the shape of what the handle will look like, and then I just added more dimension for the width. For the top part, you can see the outside of the handle, whereas at the bottom, I'm going to show the inside of the handle. By the way, this is the reference image that I used for this painting. I really think the shape of the cup is really cute. I also like the color and the texture, and I also like the contrast between the pastel blue and the yellow or the golden brown croissant, but you can always replace this to cookies or any other baked goods as well. Here I'm adding on the texture from the ribs of the cup. Don't forget to do this, or else those lines might look flat and hand painted instead of it looking three-dimensional. Then after this, I'm going to add the croissant on the right hand side. I'm just going to draw this loosely, and I'm not really following the reference here, but since I want the croissant to be seen from the side, you can see the layers on the left side but not on the right. By the way, like usual, I'll have the outline in my coffee shop in case you want to get straight to painting. Once I'm done, I'm going to erase the coffee cup line so it doesn't go over the croissant. After erasing, I'm going to clean out the lines for the croissant as well, so it's a bit easier to see the separate sections. That's it for the outline. It's fairly simple. Next, I'm going to go over the colors. This is Vermilion by Holbein, Titanium Gold Ochre by Schmincke, Burnt Umber by Holbein, Grey of Grey by Holbein, Cobalt Green by Holbein, Payne's Grey Bluish by Schmincke, and Bleedproof White by Dr. P.H. Martens. Now let's get to painting. Since the croissant's at the front, this is the first thing that I'm going to paint. I'm going to start by dampening the surface of the whole area. Then I'm going to pick up a little bit of titanium gold ochre to paint in the area of the layers that is visible on the left side. I'm just painting following the curvature. Then I'm going to follow this up with a mix of burnt umber and vermilion into the titanium gold ochre. I'm going to place this around the edges of those sections. I'm starting with just the edges here since I feel like the titanium gold ochre is still a bit too damp, and once it starts to dry off though, I'm going to use the same mix in a thin consistency and just add on lines to represent the layers, and I painted this following the curvature of the croissant to give it some volume. Then with a thin consistency of the same mix, I'm going to paint the top layer of the croissant. And again, I'm following the curvature as I'm painting this, and I also tried to make it slightly textured by leaving a little bit of negative space. The negative space that I left out is completely random though. However, if you're good at lighting and how light works, I'm pretty sure there should be an exact space, but I'm not very good at it, so I'm just trying to guess along the way. So here I'm painting section by section, and I also want to paint on the right hand side of the croissant as well. Next, I'm going to use a muted brown from a mix of burnt umber and a bit of Payne's Gray Bluish. I'm going to use this to paint some shadows on the area of the layers. Once the top layer of the croissant is completely dry, I'm going to add another layer, this time with a more vibrant color. I'm still using the previous mixture, but I added some vermilion and burnt umber. I'm going to paint this the same way, but this time in a medium consistency, but I still want to leave out a little bit of small negative spaces to represent the crackle of the pastry. I also want to build the shadow in between the layers little by little using a medium consistency of the previous mix from burnt umber and Payne's Gray Bluish. And I'm just basically going to repeat these steps for the sections on the left first. I'm going to build a bit more texture for the top layers, and I'm using the same mix before, but this has more vermilion compared to the burnt umber, so it's a bit more vibrant. As you can see, I like to wiggle the tip of my brush around. While doing this, just like before, I'm leaving out some negative space, but I'm randomizing it, so some areas you can see the previous layer through, and some layers you can just see some white for extra glossiness. Here I'm adding more lines for the texture of the layers, but I want to make sure that the color is fairly similar to the base because I want the layers to look really fine. Now I'm working on the right hand side, and I'm just going to use the same mixture as before with the same technique, painting at each section at a time. Then in between, I'm just going to add a bit more burnt umber into the previous mix and separate those sections. I'm also going to layer on a bit of that extra texture, but I'm limiting this since I want the front to have more detail than the back. Now let's move on to the coffee cup. I'm going to use a mix of cobalt green with gray of gray to create the pastel blue tone, but I'm going to start with a very thin consistency with a lot of water to cover the whole surface. I want to leave the rim as well as the bottom blank for now. Still working on the damp surface, I'm going to pick up a bit more pigment and a slightly thicker consistency, but this is still fairly light, and I want to darken each section from the left side. For the side of the handle, I'm going to use the same mix, but I added some Payne's Gray Bluish to mute the color. Then for the outside face, I dampened the surface using the light consistency of the base color, and I also used the same dark mixture with the added Payne's Gray Bluish. Now going back to the cup itself, I'm going to section it out once the surface is completely dry. I'm using a light consistency of the muted teal, and I left out lines to separate the sections. I also left the right hand side, then I used a clean damp brush to fill in the right hand side as well as those lines, so they're a little bit lighter than the rest of the areas that I painted initially. And I also want to paint the inside of the handle using the same color. For the bottom of the cup, I'm going to actually just use the brown color from the croissant. I'm just going to layer using a thin consistency, then I'm going to add some Payne's Gray Bluish starting from the left. Now moving back again to the main part of the cup, I'm going to use a mix of Payne's Grey Bluish, the base color, as well as a little bit of burnt umber to mute the color even more. I'm just going to layer a thin consistency to separate the sections again. Then while the surface is still damp, I'm going to use the same color in a thicker consistency to paint more shadow on the left side as well as at the bottom of the lines that we left blank. Since I'm not very good with lighting, I'm going to use the reference image for the shadow placement. You can see that the middle of the cup is in shadow, so I'm going to add more Payne's Grey Bluish in the mix, and I'm also using a slightly thicker consistency. I feel like the color is a bit too saturated and it's also not dark enough, so I'm going to layer Payne's Grey Bluish with burnt umber this time to mute the color. I'm going to place it in the same area in the middle and also the left side this time while leaving a bit of space in between. Now I'm going to go back to the handle and darken it as well. This is the same mix of Payne's Grey Bluish and burnt umber. On the right hand side, I want the color to be a bit more vibrant, so this is from a mix of cobalt green and gray of grey with a touch of the dark blue. Now going back to the Payne's Grey and burnt umber mix in a very thin consistency, you can see that it's almost like a grey color, and I'm going to continue it with the vibrant blue on the left. As for the rim, I'm going to mix those two colors and I'm going to use a very thin consistency to lightly cover it. I just want to redefine the lines here, so I'm painting underneath it using a thin consistency of the Payne's Grey with a bit of burnt umber. Next, I'm going to move on to the cast shadow. I'm starting by dampening the surface. Then I'm going to use a mix of burnt umber and Payne's Grey Bluish. This has quite a bit of burnt umber, so you can see that the color is almost like a neutral gray. I'm going to start with a medium consistency and I'm going to bring it outwards. Then closer to the cup as well as the croissant, I'm going to go back with a slightly thicker consistency while the surface is still damp. I want the edges to be very nice and soft, so I like to just add clean water and try to blend it outwards. Still working on the damp surface, I'm going to use a thick consistency of Payne's Grey Bluish here just to add a little bit more interest to the color, and closer to the croissant, I'm going to add a thick consistency of burnt umber. Since the surface of the cast shadow is quite wet, I'm going to go back to the cup. I'm just using the dark brown mixture. I'm just going to layer in a bit more color, following the darker values as how I've placed it for the blue part of the cup. I feel like we're ready to paint the drink now. For this, I'm using a mix of titanium gold ochre with burnt umber and a bit of vermilion. And I'm starting with a light consistency. Then I'm going to follow this up with a thicker consistency, and I'm placing the thicker consistency randomly on the damp surface. I want the texture to be nice and soft, so I'm continuously working on the damp surface. Now I'm going to add more burnt umber for a darker brown, and again I'm just going to place it randomly. Try to not cover this whole part, but leave some space where it's a bit darker and some areas with more of the light brown. I'm going to leave it to dry and move on to the background. I'm going to start by dampening the surface. Please be careful with the rim. I don't want to get water there because I want the rim to be lighter than the rest of the painting. And for the color, I'm going to use the grayish mixture, but I'm going to play a bit with the ratio, so some parts are a bit more brown and some of the background is a little bit more gray. I'm just painting really lightly, then I want to dampen the whole area on top of the cup. This includes parts of the drink itself as well as the side of the cup. The dampening of this area is to reactivate the paint, and I'm going to take off the excess with tissue to create the steam effect. You can also help redefine the steam by darkening the sides, so there's a bit more contrast. Personally, I didn't really have a shape in mind for the steam, so I think mine looks a bit weird. I would suggest for you to maybe intentionally make curvy, wavy lines for them, so it doesn't look as messy as mine. After this, I'm going to go back to the drink because I feel like the brown looks a little bit too muted. So I mixed some titanium gold ochre into the brown mixture, which will make the brown a bit more creamy. Then I'm going to add more burnt umber and vermilion to place it in those random areas again. As you can see, by darkening the sides of the steam, you can also help to shape it, but again, sadly, I didn't really have anything in mind, so I was just making a mess here. Maybe it'll help to even look for references specifically for steam to help you with this part. At some point, I even tried to fix it with a thin consistency of bleed-proof white, but I don't think it was going anywhere, so I ditched that idea and just moved on to the drink. This is my favorite part to paint because it just brings the whole painting together in my opinion. For the bubbles, I'm going to use a mix of burnt umber and Payne's Grey Bluish in a thick consistency, and I also switch to my synthetic brush. You can also switch to a smaller brush if it's a bit easier to control. But what I'm going to do here is to add circles in different sizes. I try to make larger ones as well as smaller ones. Then I like to fill in some parts with just tiny little dots. It's up to you how much you want to cover the drink with the bubbles, but I'm only going to place mine around the outside. And I also want to be very careful to not paint on top of the steam. When you are painting the bubbles, be very careful to not include too many large ones though, because you want to fill most of them with the smaller dots. After this, I'm going to give a bit more dimension to the large bubbles, so I'm going to add more Payne's Grey Bluish in the ratio to create almost a black color, and I'm going to place this inside of the large circles, but I'm leaving a little bit of the base color for the top part of the circle. Now, to make the bubbles look like actual bubbles, I'm going to use a thick consistency of bleed-proof white. I use a dry brush load, so my brush comes to a very fine point, and I'm going to just add white dots on top of the large circles and the medium-sized circles. If you have a bit more space in the large circles, you can also extend it into a curved line and a dot, or even add 2 dots. Next, I'm going to paint the texture on the cup, just like the reference image. I'm just placing these dots randomly in different sizes as well as different shapes. And in terms of the color, I used the base color of this cup, which is from a mix of gray and cobalt green. Then I added Payne's Grey Bluish and a little bit of burnt umber to mute the color. I'm using a thick consistency to start with, then I'm going to follow this up by smudging it using a clean damp brush. But while I wait for those dots to completely dry, I'm going to use the same color as these dots in a light consistency to repaint the rim. Now you can see me reactivating the paint again using a clean damp brush, and I'm just dotting in a little bit of water. Then once the paint is reactivated, I'm going to use the excess paint to paint more dots next to them or close to that area. This will just help make the dots look more organic, as if it's made out of natural material instead of printed texture. After this, I'm just going to try to fix the value a little bit more to give more definition and form to the cup. On the left, I felt like it needs to be darkened, but also the color needs to be a bit more vibrant, so I didn't use as much burnt umber, and at the bottom I also layered a bit more brown. To finish everything off, I'm going to paint the surface underneath the cup and the croissant so it doesn't look like they're floating. I'm just going to make a very loose and light wood texture. The color that I use is a very light consistency of titanium gold ochre with a touch of burnt umber and vermilion. Then while the surface is still damp, I'm going to use a thicker consistency to paint some lines to represent the slabs of wood. If parts of the base color is a bit too dry, I'm going to help smudge the lines, then follow this up with a darker brown. This has a bit of Payne's gray bluish now, so the brown is also more muted. Then I'm going to paint thinner lines on top. After finishing the cup, I feel like I need to redefine the croissant now. I'm still using the same mixture as before, and I'm just going to add more texture using my smaller brush this time. I'm still using the same techniques as before, but I'm going to add a bit more of the crackly texture of the crust and also separate the rolls of pastry on the side. And that's basically it for this tutorial. I know I still need a lot of practice, especially when it comes to the steam, but I think it's not too bad for the first try, and I hope you still found this somewhat useful. Like usual, the list of tools as well as my social media links will be in the description box. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please consider subscribing, and if you're still here, thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you guys at the next one. Bye!